Last week we spoke about the liberation of Bataan and Corregidor. The Shimbu Group's commander launched a coordinated raid on northern Manila, aiming to weaken enemy defenses. Despite heavy casualties, the Allies captured key locations including Nichols Field. Meanwhile, General Chase's 38th Division overcame strong Japanese defenses at Zigzag Pass, while General Hall's forces secured Bataan. Plans for the airborne assault on Corregidor were set for February the 16th, leveraging surprise against the outnumbered Japanese garrison. American forces launched the strategic attack upon Corregidor, dropping paratroopers from the 503rd Regiment. Despite facing sporadic fire, they secured their key positions. The following days, they saw intense skirmishes as the 3rd Battalion, 34th Regiment landed and established a foothold. Over 8 days, they repelled numerous Japanese counterattacks, inflicting heavy casualties. By February the 26th, organized resistance crumbled, leading to the island's capture. Meanwhile, in Manila, American troops advanced, clearing buildings and securing the city, inching closer to an overall victory in the Philippines. This episode is the invasion of Iwo Jima. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a humorous episode. It's a retrospective looking at the TV show Deadliest Warrior, if you remember that one. As for Echoes of War, we just covered the evolution of the Roman Republic army. It's a pretty interesting episode. I do recommend it. And hey, if you want to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. A few weeks ago, we were speaking about Operation Detachment. Admirals Nimitz and Spruance were planning an invasion of Iwo Jima, and General Smith's 5th Amphibious Corps would be part of it. During a thorough campaign of preliminary air and naval bombardment against the Volcano Islands, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions, along with the Corps units, were loaded at Hawaii between December the 25th and the 25th of January. Once training and loading were complete, Admiral Turner's Task Force 51 and Admiral Hill's Task Force 53 departed Pearl Harbor on January the 27th, initially heading towards Saipan. By February the 12th, Admiral Spruance's 5th Fleet had gathered in the Marianas, and now they were prepared to set sail for Iwo Jima. Additionally, Admiral Mitcher's Task Force 58 had departed Ulithi to conduct a series of supporting airstrikes over and around Tokyo, known as Operation Jamboree. Task Force 58 sortied from Ulithi on February the 10th and shaped a course eastwards for the Marianas and the Bonins. On the 12th, the air groups rehearsed with the 3rd Marine Division in Tiananmen. 2 days later, the task force fueled at sea from one of Admiral Berry's replenishment groups. Everything possible was done to guard against detection. Measures included radio deception, scouting by the Pacific Fleet submarines to dispose of any picket vessels that might be en route, scouting by B-29s, and Navy liberators from the Marianas to clear the air. On the 15th, a scouting line of 5 destroyers ranged ahead of the carriers, and anti-submarine air patrol was set up. At about 7 p.m., a high-speed run-in began towards launching positions where the carriers arrived at dawn on the 16th of February. Thanks to these precautions, and to thick weather most of the way, they arrived completely undetected. General LeMay's 21st Bomber Command, which was being reinforced by the 313th and 314th Bombardment Wings, would also assist detachment with several strikes against Japan. Following some unremarkably high-altitude daytime missions in late January, 129 B-29s from the 73rd and 313th Bombardment Wings targeted Kobe on February the 3rd, using a mix of incendiaries and fragmentation bombs. This attack caused significant damage to urban areas and local war production, resulting in the loss of 2 bombers and damage to about 35 others. Subsequently, on February the 10th, a precision strike was launched against Ota's Nakajima Aircraft Factory, with 84 out of 118 dispatched B-29s successfully bombing the site. However, only 14% of the bombs hit the target, leading to the loss of 12 bombers and damage to 29. Nearly one-third of the factory buildings sustained damage, primarily from the incendiaries combined with high-explosive bombs. 5 days later, LeMay dispatched 117 B-29 bombers to target Mitsubishi's engine works in Nagoya. However, an unexpected cold front resulted in only 33 bombers reaching the target area, yielding lackluster results. Meanwhile, after conducting some assault rehearsals, Spruance's amphibious support forces and tractor group set sail for Iwo Jima on February the 14th, followed 2 days later by Turner's main assault convoy. At the same time, the Reserve 3rd Marine Division continued loading at Guam, whilst 21st Marines departed for Iwo Jima on February the 16th, followed by the main body of the division the next day. On the morning of the 16th, Admiral Blandy's amphibious support force arrived off Iwo Jima and promptly commenced the final preliminary bombardment and minesweeping operations, although inclement weather hindered these efforts. However, the next day, Task Force 52 successfully carried out these missions. Beach reconnaissance by UDTs phased heavy motor fire, resulting in the sinking of one LSI gunboat, damage to 11 others, and casualties were about 44 killed and 152 wounded. Despite this, the frogmen encountered no obstacles on the beaches and managed to create accurate maps of the approaches. Meanwhile, by February the 16th, Mitscher's carriers had quietly moved up to a position 60 miles off the coast of Honshu, launching extensive fighter sweeps against the airfields in Tokyo Bay and bombing raids on aircraft frame and engine plants in the Tokyo area. About 100 Japanese aircraft attacked Admiral Davidson's planes as they crossed the coast, and about 40 of them were shot down. American pilots found the Japanese, on the whole, reluctant to engage. Admiral Mitscher had correctly told his pilots, "He is probably more afraid of you than you are of him." In fact, the IJAF 10th Hikoshidan immediately ordered the IJAF Night Fighter Group and all second-class personnel to take cover, while all aircraft not intercepting were ordered to be dispersed, fuel tanks drained, and ammunition unloaded. In contrast, American pilots reported Tokyo anti-aircraft fire to be, quote, "the most accurate and intense yet encountered." By nightfall, Rear Admiral Matthias Gardner's Night Flying Carrier Group conducted a sweep of night fighters to cover the enemy airfields at dusk. This operation was repeated the following morning, but poor weather ultimately forced the carriers to retreat towards Iwo Jima. Despite this, significant damage was inflicted on aircraft frame and engine facilities, with 10 vessels sunk, including the unfinished escort carrier Yamashi Omaru. A total of 531 aircraft were reported destroyed, at the expense of losing 88 planes and damaging 2 destroyers. On February the 18th, after the enemy battery camouflage had been obliterated during the previous 2 days of bombardment, this revealed batteries not previously known to exist. The island's defenses were for the first time properly revealed, and formidable they were indeed. Fortunately for the Americans, the support of UDTs with LCI gunboats had convinced General Kurebayashi that the main landing had already started, and to repel it, he had unmasked batteries that would have caused very heavy casualties on D-Day had they not been discovered the 2 days prior. This was the only serious mistake made by the Japanese general in his defensive tactics, which won the rueful admiration of his enemies. Blandy opted to focus on the immediate area and flanks of the eastern beaches. Heavy ships moved closer about 2,500 yards to deliver concentrated direct fire upon all the targets. Consequently, bombardment ships provided continuous direct fire throughout the day, effectively dismantling enemy defenses. However, during the night, the Japanese launched a minor raid that caused significant damage to the destroyer minesweeper Gamble and the destroyer escort Blessman. At around 6 a.m. on February the 19th, Turner's main force arrived off Iwo Jima and began maneuvering into final positions. Simultaneously, Admiral Rogers' warships executed the last pre-landing bombardment, coordinated with airstrikes from Mitscher's carriers. Between 8:25 and 8:55, the first wave crossed the line of departure and advanced towards the shore under the protective rocket fire of gunboats. Shells fell heavily on Iwo Jima, marking the most intense pre-landing bombardment of World War II. At 8:57, as the leading armored Amtraks approached their targets, naval gunfire shifted inland and to the flanks. The LVTs of the first wave touched down on Iwo Jima at 9:02 and began moving forward through high terraces of soft black volcanic ash, engaging inland targets from the water to support subsequent landings. 3 minutes later, the Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions started landing side by side on green, red, yellow, and blue beaches. The assault infantry battalions of the landing force received assistance throughout D-Day from all the supporting arms available to the amphibious support force. Carrier pilots of Task Force 58 and the escort carriers of Task Force 52 flew missions all day as airborne observers and spotters maintained constant vigilance over the target. Including pre-8-hour strikes, 606 support aircraft flew 26 missions on February the 19th and dropped over 270,000 pounds of bombs. These planes also fired 2,254 rockets into the island defenses and dropped over 100 napalm bombs. Air and naval gunfire liaison teams remained in communication with both air and sea supporting units throughout the hectic hours that followed the beach assault. Naval rifles from 5 to 16-inch caliber pounded enemy positions in response to Marine requests. Gunfire support vessels engaged enemy artillery that covered landing areas from the high ground to the north and concentrated on concealed Japanese mortars and shelled the landing areas with deadly effect. The units quickly reorganized and began their advance inland, facing only light resistance, although their progress was hampered by the sandy terrain. General Gurubayashi's forces, however, had been waiting in well-fortified underground positions as planned, emerging only after the bombardment ceased to unleash a barrage of machine gun rifle motor fire upon the advancing troops. As the initial waves of Marines struggled to advance, congestion along the shore became increasingly critical, while the full force of the Japanese defenders was unleashed shortly after 10. By 10:30, elements from all 8 assault battalions had landed on the island, successfully bringing ashore about 6,000 men and bulldozers that were clearing paths for tank deployment. On the far left flank, Colonel Harry Livingston's 28th Marines, having landed at Green Beach, initiated a rapid advance across a half-mile isthmus below Mount Sodachi to isolate the crucial position. The attack unfolded in such a way that some units were delayed while others managed to break through and continue westward despite suffering heavy casualties, ultimately crossing the island while the bypassed enemy was being dealt with. By midday, the reserve 3rd Battalion and tanks landed under heavy fire to join the afternoon assault upon Sodachi, but intense enemy fire hindered their progress to their assault positions. Consequently, the 2nd Battalion launched an attack on its own, gaining only 150 yards before retreating to regroup with the 3rd Battalion for the night. At the same time, Colonel Thomas Warnham's 27th Marines had landed on the Red Beaches, making swift progress inland despite increasing casualties and bypassing numerous enemy positions. By 11:30, Company A was moving across the southern end of Airfield No. 1, establishing a presence along the western edge, while other units continued to advance past the airfield. The 1st Battalion launched an attack on the airfield with tank support but faced strong enemy resistance, resulting in minimal gains. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion pushed westward and reached the cliffs overlooking the western coast. Additionally, the reserve 3rd Battalion landed and began clearing bypass positions, while the artillery units from the 13th Marines and General Rocky's Reserve 26 Marines also arrived in the afternoon, as the 27th and 28th Marines solidified their positions. By nightfall, although the 5th Marine Division was still a considerable distance from the 01 line, it had established a firm foothold on the island, with Mount Sodachi isolated and portions of the airfield under their control. Over to the east, General Cate's 4th Marine Division had also landed successfully, with Colonel Walter Wensinger's 23rd Marines coming ashore at Yellow Beaches and Colonel John Lanigan's 25th Marines landing on Blue Beach 1 and the southern part of Blue Beach 2. The two regiments began their advance inland, hindered by intense enemy fire, but managed to gain between 400 and 600 yards by midday. As tanks were being deployed, the 3rd Battalion of the 25th Marines moved to the right to clear the remaining area of Blue Beach 2 and encircle the threatening quarry zone. Now at this stage, the assault battalions continued their advance. Wensinger and Lanigan deployed their reserve battalions to cover the gaps in their attack lines. With the support of tanks that had finally reached the front, the 23rd Marines advanced towards Airfield No. 1 and successfully captured its outskirts. Meanwhile, the 25th Marines initiated a coordinated assault, with the 3rd Battalion advancing about 200 yards along the beach to secure the problematic quarry, while the other 2 battalions moved north to seize the high ground to the northwest of the quarry. By the end of the day, Cates had also landed half of the artillery from the 14th Marines, along with his reserve 24th Marines, which began to relieve some of the frontline units from both assault regiments. Although the penetration by the 4th Marine Division was not as extensive as intended, by nightfall the front lines included the eastern edge of the airfield and extended sufficiently inland from the Blue Beaches to ensure the beachhead could be held successfully. The Marines, forced to advance across open terrain while enduring intense fire from well-concealed positions that were difficult to target, fell significantly short of the 01 objective. Nonetheless, by the end of the day, 6 Marine regiments, an equal number of artillery battalions, and 2 tank battalions had landed and were positioned to defend the narrow beachhead against a potential night counterattack. Throughout this first day, the situation on the beaches prevented landing of any but the highest priority hot cargo, This consisted of ammunition, rations, water, and signal equipment brought to the beach in LCVPs and LCMs. Shore party teams, working under extremely adverse conditions without sufficient trucks and other heavy equipment, could do little more than stack the supplies on the beach above the high water mark. LVTs and weasels made trips from the beach dumps inland carrying these supplies to the troops and returned bearing wounded men. The busy Amtraks also made non-stop trips from the LCTs, ferrying critically needed items directly to the Marines on the front lines. Most of the transports and other vessels of the task force retired from the island at nightfall, but such command ships, preloaded LCTs, and hospital LCTs remained behind. Emergency items, especially the 81mm motor ammunition, were brought in during the night, but actually very little unloading was accomplished, and many of the wounded spent this night on the beach because they could not be evacuated. Some progress was made cutting exits through the terrace and clearing mines, but the enemy fire and shortage of equipment limited this activity. Despite this, the Japanese did not launch any large-scale assaults, although their motors and artillery relentlessly bombarded the Marine lines along the front throughout the night. Consequently, Allied casualties on the first day totaled 548 killed and 1,755 wounded. On February the 20th, the goal for the 28th Marines was to take Mount Sodachi, while other units advanced north to capture the two airfields. Initially in the south, after a coordinated air and naval bombardment, Liver's Edge launched another assault on the volcano, but managed to gain only 75 yards by midday. During the forenoon, Marines gained only 50 to 70 yards. Aircraft and ships pounded Japanese positions, and the 3rd Battalion, 13th Marines fired mission after mission, but stiff enemy resistance continued, particularly from well-concealed pillboxes hidden in the brush to the front of the Marine lines. These emplacements, too close to friendly troops to be engaged by heavy support weapons, could only be silenced by coordinated attacks on assault demolition teams using flamethrowers and explosive charges. Tanks then moved in to provide support, allowing the attack to progress from pillbox to pillbox. However, by the end of the day, the Marines had only advanced 200 difficult yards. Meanwhile, Schmidt's other regiments initiated a coordinated offensive to the north following extensive artillery, naval gunfire, and aircraft support. Despite facing heavy resistance, the 23rd Marines successfully overran most of Airfield No. 1 by noon. Wessinger continued to push his units in the afternoon, but progress was limited as tanks were hindered by minefields and rough terrain. Warrenham's 27th Marines pressed their attack on the left flank, overcoming enemy motor and artillery fire to gain about 800 yards along the coast. In contrast, Lanigan's 25th Marines, affected by friendly fire, made only minimal advances against enemy crossfire from concealed positions. At about 4 p.m., friendly planes misdirected their fire on the 25th Marines area, adding terror to the situation. An airstrike consisting of .50 caliber machine gun strafing with rockets and bombs fell on the troops of Company B of the 24th Marines, which was positioned on top of a quarry some 400 yards inland from the eastern shore. This strike was made without a preliminary dry run, and despite the fact the yellow front line panels were displayed prior and during the aerial attack. The 1st Battalion 24th Marines suffered 5 killed and 6 wounded as a result of this misguided effort. Shortly after the planes left the area, this battalion reported that friendly artillery and naval gunfire was being registered on its lines. Due to slow progress, Schmidt attempted to land his reserve 21st Marines by high seas, and congested beaches ultimately thwarted these efforts. Nevertheless, the remaining 14th Marines were landed, albeit with significant casualties, and elements of the Corps' artillery began to come ashore. During the night, there was no counterattacks on Mount Sodachi, but the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions had to fend off some small counterattacks on their front lines. On February the 21st, following a strike involving 40 aircraft, Liver Edge's 28th Marines launched another assault on the volcano. The 1st Battalion on the right swiftly advanced along the west beach to the base of Sodachi, while the 3rd Battalion in the center pushed nearly to a foot of the mountain, despite facing heavy resistance. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion on the left moved cautiously along the east beach towards the volcano's base, with Company F heading towards Tobiishi Point. At the same time, other regiments continued their offensive towards the O1, after a bombardment from the air, artillery and rockets and naval gunfire was unleashed. Rocky's units made significant progress, advancing over 1,000 yards, while the 23rd Marines achieved similar gains on the left flank, but they were slightly sheltered areas, allowing for local and limited encirclement. Because of this, they advanced 100 yards in the right and center. The 25th Marines maintained steady pressure against the strong enemy defenses, gaining between 50 and 300 yards across the front. Colonel Harnell Wither's 21st Marines successfully landed this time. Due to heavy casualties in the center, they were assigned to relieve the exhausted 23rd Marines. By nightfall, the Marines had to fend off several local counterattacks and infiltration attempts. During the night, 50 kamikaze planes targeted Blandy's Task Force 52. They were picked up by the radar of the USS Saratoga, a veteran carrier of the Pacific War, and 6 fighters were sent to intercept them. They shot down 2 Zeros, but the remaining Zeros plowed on through the low-lying clouds, 2 of them trailing smoke, and they slammed into the side of the carrier, turning the hangars into an inferno. Another solitary attacker smashed into the flight deck, leaving a gaping 100-yard hole from the bow. Damage control teams worked wonders, and within 1 hour the fires were under control, and the Saratoga was able to recover a few of her planes. Another aircraft, which happened to be a Betty, tore into the escort carrier, the USS Bismarck C. The decks were full of aircraft, and the ensuing explosion caused uncontrollable fires. The abandoned ship was sounded off as 800 men went over the side. Within just a few minutes, a huge explosion ripped off the entire stern of the carrier, and she rolled 38 over and sank. 3 other ships were also damaged. The escort carrier, the USS Lunga Point, was showered with flaming debris, as 4 aircraft were blasted out of the sky. The minesweeper, Ko Cook, was damaged when a Jill dive bomber hit her deck, and LST-477, loaded with Sherman tanks, received a glancing blow. The Saratoga, with her destroyer escort, returned to Pearl Harbor, but by the time the damage was repaired, the war would be already over. The kamikazes had done their work well. 358 men were killed, 1 carrier was sunk, and another was severely damaged. It was to be a grim preview of the mayhem they would later cause during the invasion of Okinawa in April. On February the 22nd, amidst a dreary cold rain, Liversedge renewed his assault on Sodachi, where only half of his original garrison remained to oppose the Marine advance. There was no let-up in the weather on Wednesday, as the Marines of the 20th Regiment, drenched to skin and bone by the wind, prepared to renew the attack upon Sodachi. Fresh supplies and ammunition had been brought up to the front during the night, but the Shermans were mired in the mud, and the Navy declined to supply air support in the appalling weather. It was up to the foot soldier with his rifle, flamethrower, grenade, and demolition charge to win the day. Colonel Atsuchi still had 800 men left, and he had no intention of allowing the Americans to earn an easy victory. Major Yamada announced, "We are surrounded by enemy craft of all sizes, shapes, and descriptions. Enemy shells have smashed out our installations and defenses. Their planes bomb and strafe, yet we remain strong and defiant. The Americans are beginning to climb the first terraces towards our defenses. Now they shall taste our steel and lead." Throughout the day, the 20th Marines engaged Japanese positions on the lower slopes of the mountain, with the 3rd Battalion making the final push to the base of Sodachi, while the other 2 battalions cleared the coastline to completely encircle the volcano. Simultaneously, Schmidt's northern sweep continued, with the 21st Marines replacing Wessinger's troops, and Colonel Chester Graham's 26th Marines taking over for the 5th Divisional Front. The 26th Marines advanced approximately 400 yards in the center, but ultimately had to withdraw as the flanking units could not progress. The 21st Marines began their assault on the formidable defenses of Colonel Akida's 145th Regiment in front of Airfield No. 2, managing to advance just 250 yards on the right. The 25th Marines were unable to launch an attack on the left due to Wither's lack of significant gains and had to fend off several local Japanese counterattacks. Howling Matt Smith aboard the USS Auburn was counting the cost. Just 3 days of battle, and the regimental returns listed 2,517 casualties for the 4th Division and 2,057 for the 5th. Over 4,574 dead and wounded at the 01 line had just been reached. Little did he know that his Marines approached the hills, ravines, canyons, gullies, and cliffs to the north, and even worse was yet to come. Additionally, as the 4th Division remained stalled, Cates ordered Colonel Walter Jordan's 24th Marines to relieve the weary troops at Lanigan on the right. During the night, most of the Task Force 58 departed the area for a second airstrike against Tokyo, which significantly limited the availability of aircraft for direct support for the ground forces on Iwo Jima. On February the 23rd, the 20th Marines under Liversedge launched their final assault on Sodachi. The 2nd Battalion was tasked with scaling the volcano's heights, while the 1st Battalion advanced south around the mountain's western side. To their surprise, they encountered no enemy fire, and small patrols reached the crater's edge by 9:40. First Lieutenant Harold G. Schreier, executive officer of Company E, and a 40-man detachment set out to follow the patrols and occupy the highest point of land on Iwo Jima. The number of live Japanese lurking in the caves along this north face was unknown, so flankers were sent out to guard against ambush as Schreier's men clawed their way warily upwards. Still, there was a mysterious lack of enemy activity, and the only Japanese encountered were the harmless dead. Positions along the rim of the crater were reached at about 10:15 as the Marines scrambled over the lip. the tenseness was eased by action. A small defending force challenged the patrol, and a short, hot fight developed. Even while the skirmish was in progress, some of the men located a length of Japanese iron pipe, secured a small American flag to one end, and they raised the Stars and Stripes at 10:20. It was an inspiring sight for thousands of Americans on Iwo Jima as the flag waved bravely from the summit. Shortly after mounting of this flag, that measured only 54 inches by 28 inches, an unidentified Marine went aboard LST 779, beached near the base of the volcano, to obtain a larger set of colors. As this second and larger flag was being carried up the slopes of Sodachi, photographer Joe Rosenthal, who had covered the Iwo Jima operation for the Associated Press, noticed it instantly, and he started in a close pursuit. His efforts that morning resulted in the now famous picture of the second flag raising. There's actually a fascinating little story about the second raising of the flag. And since it's one of my favorite movies, I just wanted to add this passage from the book, Flags of Our Fathers by James Bradley. The Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, had decided the previous night that he wanted to go ashore and witness the final stage of the fight for the mountain. Now under a stern commitment to take orders from General Howland Mad Smith, the Secretary was churning ashore in the company of a blunt, earthly general. Their boat touched the beach just after the flag went up, and the mood amongst the high command turned jubilant. Gazing upwards at the red, white, and blue speck, Forrestal remarked to Smith, "Holland, the raising of that flag on Sodachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. Forrestal was so taken with the fever of the moment that he decided he wanted the 2nd Battalion's flag flying on Mount Sodachi as a souvenir. The news of this wish did not sit well with the 2nd Battalion Commander Chandler Johnson, whose temperament was every bit as fiery as Howling Mad's. "To hell with that," the colonel spat when the message reached him. The flag belonged to the battalion, and as far as Johnson was concerned, he decided to secure it as soon as possible and dispatched his assistant operations officer, Lieutenant Ted Tuttle, to the beach to open a replacement flag. As an afterthought, Johnson called after Tuttle, "And make it an even bigger one." Following this, the 20th Marines conducted mop-up operations to eliminate remaining enemy positions and seal off caves at the base of Sodachi. All accessible outer and inner slopes were covered as the Marines annihilated enemy snipers and blasted shut many cave entrances, sealing in an uncounted number of Japanese. Much observation equipment was found, emphasizing the fact that it had been an excellent point of vantage from which hostile observers directed murderous fire against the entire beachhead. Marine artillerymen, ready and eager to seize this advantage, hastened to move flash-ranging equipment into position. By nightfall, approximately 122 Japanese soldiers were killed while attempting to infiltrate the American lines. Over the 5-day period, the 28th Marines suffered 895 casualties, while nearly 2,000 Japanese were either killed or trapped in over 1,000 caves in the area. Kuribayashi had not anticipated the loss of this strategically significant location so early in the battle, and the survivors who managed to breach the American lines faced severe reprimands upon their return to the north. For the remainder of the month, the 20th Marines focused on clearing out stubborn Japanese forces, reorganizing and re-equipping. Meanwhile, fighting in the north persisted as the 3 assault regiments advanced towards the O2 line. The 26th and 21st Marines faced heavy fire and struggled to make progress, while the 24th Marines advanced along the entire front, gaining up to 300 yards in some areas. On this day, the situation on the beach steadily improved as clearance efforts, construction of exits, and unloading continued, facilitating the arrival of essential ammunition and the additional 25 tanks. On February the 24th, following extensive air, naval, and artillery preparations, the offensive resumed. However, the initial failure of the tanks to join the assault due to the minefields and heavy anti-tank fire forced the Marines to advance slowly under intense fire from various sources. In the center of the 3rd Battalion, 21st Marines advanced 800 yards, reaching the north side of the east-west runway of Airfield No. 2, while the 2nd Battalion gradually moved northwards around the end of the runway by noon. In the afternoon, a tank support began to arrive, where the 3rd Battalion captured the hill north of the airstrip after a fierce hand-to-hand battle. Simultaneously, his 2nd Battalion coordinated with the 26th Marines to seize the elevation beyond the airfield. Graham's troops easily secured the ground in front, but had to pause their advance when they found themselves about 400 yards ahead of the 21st Marines. Over on the right flank, the 24th Marines initially made significant progress alongside Wither's men towards the airfield, but were ultimately halted by strong defenses on Charlie Dog Ridge. Running along the southeast edge of the east-west runway of Airfield No. 2 was a ridge known as Charlie Dog Ridge. In prolongation of this ridge, on a lower level to the southeast, was a semicircular rise of ground that formed the amphitheater. In this area, Japanese engineers had constructed some of the most formidable defenses on the island. From the south, the approach traversed bare flat ground swept by guns on the ridge. To the east, the route led across a weird series of volcanic outcroppings and draws. It was against these positions that the 24th Marines moved out of D+5. Assault squads then had to methodically clear the ridge, moving from one strongpoint to another, using fire and explosives until Charlie Dog was secured. While the overall gains for the day were notable by Iwo Jima standards, the casualty figures were also high, with the Marines suffering 1,034 killed and 3,741 wounded during the 5-day push to the second airfield. Additionally, the remainder of General Erskine's 3rd Marine Division began landing that day to officially take control over the central area. On February the 25th, a decision was made to hold back the 26th Marines to allow the 3rd Division to align with them. After another intense bombardment, Colonel Howard Kenyon's 9th Marines advanced through the 21st to continue the assault, but the 2-battalion attack only managed to gain a meager 100 yards against Akita's determined defenders. Kenyon then deployed his reserve 3rd Battalion in the center, but it also failed to break through. To the east, the 23rd and 24th Marines launched simultaneous attacks, but only the 23rd made significant progress, overrunning the eastern edge of the strip and establishing a foothold on the high ground to the north. Meanwhile, in the morning, Mitscher's carriers conducted a second strike upon Tokyo. The Japanese sighted 600 U.S. carrier aircraft on February 25th, but Rear Admiral Ted Sherman reported, "The enemy opposition was only half-hearted, and the Japanese planes which were not shot down seemed glad to withdraw from the scene, as swiftly and unceremoniously as possible. Even here, over their capital, the enemy were notably inferior to our naval aviators in aggressiveness, tactics, and determination." Task Force 58's aircraft hit the Oda and Kozumi aircraft plants, but increasingly snowy and stormy weather meant Mitscher canceled further Tokyo strikes at 12:15. Spruance and Mitscher decided to hit Nagoya instead. En route to Nagoya, that night destroyers USS Hazelwood and Murray sank 3 small Japanese craft. Eventually, Mitscher realized Task Force 58 would not reach the launching position on time, and at 5:30 a.m., Spruance and Mitscher canceled the Nagoya strikes and headed south to refuel. Task Force 58 claimed 47 Japanese planes had been shot down, and 111 were destroyed on the ground for a total of 158 Japanese planes destroyed on February the 25th. 2 hangars, 1 radio station, and 2 trains were destroyed. About 75% of the Oda engine's plant's buildings were destroyed, and an additional 15% had been heavily damaged. The Kozuma plant had also been hit heavily, with 5 coastal vessels and several smaller craft sunk, and another 14 vessels damaged. Total U.S. losses were about 9 aircraft to anti-aircraft fire and 4 to operational causes, and 4 pilots were also killed. After Task Force 58's aircraft had plastered the Nakajima Oda airframe plant with about 45 tons of bombs, photo reconnaissance revealed Oda to be 60% destroyed and 30% heavily damaged, although half of this was believed to be due to B-29's efforts. After the photos, Task Force 58's aircraft dropped another 13 tons on the plant. The Nakajima-Kozuma plant was attacked with about 35 to 40 tons of bombs, with hits concentrated in the center of the plant. Reconnaissance showed about 20% of the Kozuma roof was damaged. The Hitachi Tachikawa aircraft engine plant was attacked by 1 task group strike, with U.S. airmen reporting excellent results. Photographs showed many bomb hits, but smoke made precise damage assessments quite difficult. Slight damage was also inflicted upon the Tachikawa airframe plant. Task Force 58's planes struck the B-29's nemesis, the Musashino Tama aircraft engine plant, with about 40 tons of bombs in the center of the Tama complex. On that same day, LeMay also dispatched 231 B-29s to attack Tokyo with incendiaries, with 172 successfully dropping over 450 tons of bombs, incinerating a square mile of the city. This operation served as a conclusive test of the incendiary bombs that the 20th Air Force had requested, with valuable lessons to be learned for the future use of them. The next day, the 26th Marines resumed their attack despite the high ground on the left remaining unclaimed, successfully advancing over 300 yards in the right and the center. Within the center, the 9th Marines continued their assault with the 1st and 2nd Battalion side by side, but they made no notable gains. Over on the right flank, the 23rd Marines launched another assault towards Hill 382, facing heavy resistance and managing to advance just 200 yards. Concurrently, Lanigan's 25th Marines moved through the battered 24th Marines, achieving an advance of approximately 100 yards before encountering intense machine gun fire from the amphitheater and the Turkey Knob. On February the 27th, Warnham's 27th Marines took over for the exhausted 26th and continued to push northwards despite rising casualties, successfully overrunning several strongpoints and gaining about 500 yards across the front. Within the center, the 9th Marines finally breached the enemy's main defenses towards Hill 1990, and they captured Hill Peter, securing airfield number 2. Meanwhile, on the right, the 4th Division pressed on against the heavily fortified Japanese positions at the Meat Grinder, advancing only 150 to 200 yards on the eastern flank, while struggling to make headway against the amphitheater and the Turkey Knob. In the final attack of the month, the 27th Marines advanced towards Hill 362A, reaching its base, but they were forced to retreat nearly 100 yards due to Japanese counterattacks and a loss of communications. Within the center, Wither's 21st Marines moved past the 9th Marines and they rapidly advanced north of airfield number 2, making significant progress on the right as they swept through the Motoyama village and they captured the high ground overlooking airfield number 3. To the east, Cates continued to send troops into the Meat Grinder, with the 23rd Marines gaining over 200 yards and launching an attack upon Hill 382, while the 25th Marines struggled to make any headway against the amphitheater and the Turkey Knob, achieving only minor gains along the coast. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, my newly titled podcast over on all major podcast platforms. Over at both of these, I recently uploaded a humorous episode I did with some friends, over a few drinks mind you, while we tried to cover what is known as the French-Indian War, and Canadian propaganda about it. If you know what Canada, a people's history is, well, that's what we talked about, and it's pretty hilarious to be honest. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And thus we have begun one of the most brutal battles of World War II, let alone the Pacific War. It was a controversial decision to invade Iwo Jima, and the Americans could never have predicted how the Japanese would change their tactics to turn the entire ordeal into one giant meat grinder.